Corporal Michael Pritch of the Little Egg Harbor Police Department in Ocean County, New Jersey, was seen stopping his car and approaching a young man who was strolling by the side of the road in a video that was uploaded on May 28, 2022. The exchange was recorded on Corporal Pritch's body-worn camera after the individual, who we will call Mr. Walker, gave him the finger.
Why you giving me the finger?
What?
What's your problem?
What?
Why you giving me the finger?
I'm walking away.
Huh?
Am I free to go?
Come
For
here.
what reason?
Why you giving me the finger? What's your problem?
Am I free to go?
No.
What, do you have a problem?
No.
You have a problem?
No.
You don't have a problem? Then we're...
Why you giving me the finger when you're walking? Huh? Come here. Get over here.
What?
Get over here.
Is that a lawful order?
Yeah.
That's legal.
No, it isn't.
Says who?
Says it all.
Pull up the law.
Huh?
Pull up the law.
What's your name?
What's the law?
What's your
What's
name?
the law?
What's your name? How old?
According to Corporal Pritch, Mr. Walker can be legally detained for giving him the finger because it is against the law to do so. As we've previously covered on ATA, the Supreme Court ruled in Cohen versus California in 1971 that the state may not, consistently with the First and 14th Amendment, make the simple public display here involved at this single four-letter expletive a criminal offense in the absence of a more specific and compelling justification. Similarly, while the First Amendment actually bans the abridgment of simply speech, the Supreme Court noted in the 1989 decision of Texas versus Johnson that its protection does not end at the spoken or written word. The First and 14th Amendments may apply to conduct if it carries enough communication-related components. The court added, in determining whether particular conduct possesses sufficient communicative elements to invoke the First Amendment, we have asked whether an intent to communicate a particularized message was present and whether the likelihood was great that the message would be understood by those who viewed it. Although the Supreme Court has not specifically addressed the question of whether raising the middle finger is protected speech, courts that have looked into the matter have generally come to the conclusion that it is because the gesture unquestionably satisfies the Texas versus Johnson test for expressive conduct. The Western District of Pennsylvania U.S. District Court, which is in the same federal circuit as New Jersey, reached this conclusion in the 2006 case of Corey versus Nissan. It said that the weight of federal authority established that pointing the middle finger at a police officer is protected speech under the First Amendment in the absence of any specific evidence that the gesture in the particular factual context amounts to fighting words or is otherwise unlawful. According to Section 2C33, 2, a person is guilty of a petty disorderly person's offense if in a public place he addresses unreasonably loud and offensively coarse or abusive language given the circumstances of the person present and the setting of the utterance to any person present with the purpose to offend the sensibilities of a hearer or in reckless disregard of the probability of doing so. The U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey ruled in Morales versus Maxwell in 2022 that a person could not be found guilty of disorderly conduct under this statute for yelling profanities at a police officer because under long-standing precedent, the statute violates the First Amendment when applied to language short of that which would incite the hearer to immediate violence, and the profanities he shouted at the officer by themselves do not constitute such an act. Given this precedent, it is very likely that a judge considering this case would rule that Mr. Walker's middle finger gesture was protected speech and that he was not entitled to be detained for disorderly conduct because he was aiming it at Corporal Pritch. Mr. Walker starts yelling for aid and Corporal Pritch grabs him and holds him with his hands behind his back. After turning off his body-worn camera, Corporal Pritch waits for assistance to arrive before turning it back on. With a few exceptions, every uniformed police enforcement officer is obliged by New Jersey law, Section 4814, 118.3, to wear a body-worn camera that electronically records audio and video while doing their official responsibilities. Additionally, Section 40A14, 118.5 states that a body-worn camera shall remain activated until the encounter has fully concluded and the officer leaves the scene whenever an officer is responding to a call for service or at the start of any other law enforcement or investigative encounter between an officer and a member of the public. The law similarly restricts when a body-worn camera can be turned off during an encounter too, when a civilian conversing with the officer requests that the device be deactivated, where it reasonably appears that the person will not provide information or otherwise cooperate with the officer unless that request is respected. When a person other than an arrestee is seeking emergency medical services for themselves or another person and requests that the device be deactivated. It is evident that Corporal Pritch's actions in turning off the body-worn camera violated both state law and the Attorney General's policy. These legal standards are expanded upon in the body-worn camera policy released by the Office of the Attorney General for the state of New Jersey. In spite of the fact that he is unable to establish a legal justification for the detention, Patrolman Michael James Lamontagne tells Mr. Walker that he must identify himself since he is being held. While courts have ruled that New Jersey's obstruction statute cannot be applied to people who refuse to identify themselves to police officers when they are not suspected of committing a motor vehicle offense, the state does not have a stop and identify statute that expressly requires Mr. Walker to identify himself. According to New Jersey Code Section 2C29, 1. A person commits an offense if he knowingly obstructs, impairs, or perverts the administration of law or other governmental function, or prevents or attempts to prevent a public servant from lawfully performing an official function through flight, intimidation, force, violence, physical interference or obstacle, or by means of any independently unlawful act. Although the law does not require that a person physically obstruct an officer in order to be found guilty of obstruction, the Superior Court of the New Jersey Appellate Division held in the 2020 case of Bryant versus Camden County Police Department that a person had the right to refuse to turn over his identification when an officer demanded it during a police investigation that was not initiated on the belief that the individual had violated a motor vehicle law and that this refusal could be justified. As a result, the court would probably find that Patrolman Lamontagne was mistaken when he said Mr. Walker was needed to give his name. Mr. Walker cursed at both of the cops before leaving without more issue when Patrolman Lamontagne told him he may leave. There isn't much information available about this encounter, and although Mr. Walker told the cops he intended to sue, it's unclear whether he ever did. Overall, Corporal Pritch and Patrolman Lamontagne receive a failing grade for their flagrant misstatements of the law throughout the interaction and for behaving with complete contempt for Mr. Walker's First Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights. They also detained him without a warrant. The officers falsely claimed that it was unlawful for Mr. Walker to use profanity and display his middle finger, that Mr. Walker was legally required to identify himself, and that their illegal detention of Mr. Walker did not violate the Fourth Amendment or even implicate it because he was not formally arrested. These assertions showed the officers' complete ignorance of some of the most fundamental legal principles that apply to law enforcement officers. It is important to talk about the fact that Corporal Pritch decided to turn off his body camera when Mr. Walker began yelling for aid, even though both officers could undoubtedly use further training, despite the fact that it was obviously against state law as well as policy. It is extremely worrisome that Corporal Pritch purposefully and illegally kept his interaction with Mr. Walker at this period from being recorded, even though Mr. Walker did not appear to be hurt when Patrolman Lamontagne arrived and the body camera was turned back on. This kind of willful behavior shows more than only a lack of legal knowledge that might be remedied by instruction. Mr. Walker receives a grade of AE because, despite giving the police officers his identification when he was not required to, he showed a strong understanding of his constitutional rights, stood up to the police when they repeatedly misrepresented the law, and even made an effort to enlighten the police about citizens' constitutional rights when they repeatedly showed their ignorance. While Mr. Walker maintained a hostile attitude towards the officers and employed some inflammatory language, he did so in accordance with his First Amendment rights, and I would advise him to proceed with his plans to sue these officers for their unlawful and unconstitutional deeds. I applaud Mr. Walker for showing interest in constitutional rights at such a young age, and this exchange exemplifies just how helpful this information can be for young individuals across the nation. Please let us know in the comments below if there is an interpersonal or legal matter you would like us to cover. I appreciate you watching.